Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Dean Hari Osofsky, and on behalf of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, I want to thank you for joining us virtually today for this important event, the launch of the Center for Racial and Disability Justice, led by Professor Jamelia Morgan. This first of its kind center is dedicated to promoting justice for people of color, people with disabilities, and individuals at the intersection of race and disability. We are extremely grateful to Professor Morgan for her vision and her impactful leadership, and are excited about the difference that this center's innovative interdisciplinary approach can make on making progress on these important social justice issues. Before we get into today's program, I want to thank not only Professor Morgan, but also the wonderful team from Northwestern Pritzker School of Law who helped make this event possible, especially Darnell Hines and Sebastian Bujak, who put together this event, and George Langford and Katrina Peters, who worked on the technology for it. I also want to acknowledge our incredible donors who helped make this center a reality. This impactful center exists because of your generosity and commitment to making a difference, and we're just incredibly grateful for that. So I'm delighted today to be joined by the inaugural leader of the Center for Racial and Disability Justice, Professor Jamelia Morgan, a leading scholar of race, gender, disability, and criminal law and punishment. Professor Morgan's research and teaching have focused on the intersection of these issues, in particular, the development of disability as a legal category in U.S. law, disability and policing, overcriminalization and the regulation of physical and social disorders, and the constitutional dimensions of criminalization of disability status. Before she joined our faculty at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, Professor Morgan served on the faculty of several law schools, most recently at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. She received a BA in political science and an MA in sociology from Stanford University, followed by a JD at Yale Law School. Prior to law school, she served as associate director of the African American Policy Forum, a social justice think tank. Through Professor Morgan's important leadership, the Center for Racial and Disability Justice will focus on pressing social issues affecting people with disabilities, particularly those whose intersectional identities create additional vulnerabilities in the legal system and society. Those include people of color, LGBTQIA+ people, women, and people with low income or socioeconomic status. While applying an intersectional approach to its research and programs, the center will work to further the goal of racial justice, together with advancing an agenda that promotes the human and civil rights of all people with disabilities. Through collaboration and interdisciplinary research, this center will tackle social problems ranging from poverty and unemployment to lack of affordable housing and quality health care, as well as race and class-based mass incarceration as it relates to the criminalization of disability in American society. This center will amplify its work and mission through activities such as guidance and support for policymakers, legal advocates, and community-based activists, research fellowships and fellows in residence for senior and junior scholars, and programming and events geared towards educating the Northwestern community and the broader public. I've been so excited at all that Professor Morgan's already developed with the center, even as we're just starting to launch it. And so, having given you a preview of the issues that this extraordinary center will be addressing, I'd like to welcome Professor Morgan to join me for a more detailed discussion. And in the meantime, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A, as we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end of our conversation. So first, you're doing important work at the intersection of race and disability. What are some of the ways in which racial and disability discrimination converge to disadvantage people with disabilities and people of color, and importantly, people at the intersection of both identities?
Absolutely. So, Dean Osofsky, it's a wonderful delight to be here. I'm so grateful to our community for the support of the center, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. So, many of the well-known issues of racial justice that we can imagine characterize some of the most pressing social problems of our day are also issues of disability discrimination, subordination, and I think I can name a few. So, mass incarceration, policing, poverty, healthcare discrimination, voting rights, educational equity. Although we might think about these issues as primarily issues of racial discrimination, and indeed our racial justice advocates across the country have centered them as such, they're also issues that reveal the problems of disability discrimination. So I'll talk a little bit about the data to help us think about how to surface issues of disability discrimination and subordination in the way we talk about some of these pressing social justice problems. So let's think about the problem of mass incarceration. When we think about the issue today, I think many of us are informed by Michelle Alexander's transformative book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. That book, along with the incredible advocacy of racial justice organizations, gave us a frame for thinking about racial bias in our criminal legal system, the disproportionate impact of the criminal legal system from policing, arrests, charging decisions, sentencing, and actual compositions within our state and federal prison facilities. We know 1 in 3 Black men will be exposed to the criminal legal system. We know that women, Black women, Latina women in particular, remain one of the fastest growing groups of incarcerated people in our country. We are attuned to the racial dynamics. But another thing to think about too is the fact that people with disabilities comprise a disproportionate number of people who are incarcerated. So by a number of statistics provided by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in particular, at the Department of Justice, we know that approximately 1 in 3 people will identify as having a disability within our jails. That can be 1 in 4 in our state facilities, state prison facilities. That's a high proportion, and the issues of disability that will arise in the carceral setting should matter to advocates. We can talk about the issue of policing. The tragedies of police violence cannot be understated. We are dealing and grappling with the after effects of the problems of policing and its role in our society. But people with disabilities, particularly people with disabilities who identify, who are regarded as people of color, are also disproportionately exposed to police violence. By the data, we know anywhere from 1 in 4 to 50% of the people killed by law enforcement every year have a diagnosed disability. That's an incredibly jarring and tragic statistic. We have to think about disability when we think about the problems of police violence. I want to talk also about poverty. We're in a moment where our rising inequality rates astound researchers and policymakers alike. But people with disabilities have for decades remained vulnerable to unemployment, so barriers and access to obtaining a job, transportation barriers, healthcare issues have made it very likely for a person with a disability. Indeed, people with disabilities are twice as likely to reside in poverty as people that do not have disabilities. I also wanted to acknowledge some of the data that's existing already, thinking intersectionally about people of color who have disabilities. So according to one report, Black and Indigenous individuals with disabilities have a poverty rate of 36% and 34% respectively. The last area I want to talk about is education. There's incredible literature and research in this area. I'm thinking of the work of Dr. Subani Anama and Jyoti Nanda. But they've talked about how children with disabilities, in particular youth of color with disabilities, are 5 times more likely to end up in the criminal legal system as a result of draconian school discipline policies, the overuse of suspension and expulsion within our schools, low-income schools of color, have led students tracked students, this is the school to prison pipeline, tracked students into the criminal legal system. They also experience higher rates of seclusion, restraint, and of course, as I said, suspension and expulsion. So I hope that I've been able to stress in just these brief remarks just how important it is to think about race and racial discrimination along with disability and disability discrimination, because we're seeing the harms of the failure to think about these intersections in advocacy that doesn't consider how people with disabilities and people of color with disabilities in particular can be trapped, can be harmed by these interlocking systems and structures.
So let's focus in a little bit on intersectionality. As Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's groundbreaking work over decades has illuminated, it's critical that we solve problems through an intersectional lens. And in my own work on environmental justice, I've seen the problems that are created because the environmental justice movement lagged both the civil rights movement and the environmental movement by a number of years. What is intersectionality and how does it inform your work?
Absolutely. I am indebted to the work of Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and her thinking around these issues. So when we think about intersectionality, we can think about it as a theory. We can think about it as a tool in advocacy movements. It's a study of how interlocking forms of oppression, whether they're social structures or systems, along with intersectional or interlocking forms of identity can converge to create vulnerabilities to violence, harm, predation. And it's an analysis, it's a way for looking at social problems and developing a set of inclusive remedies that don't marginalize individuals who have multiple identities or are experiencing harms from multiple social systems or structures, but include them in our analysis and our approach to these social problems. So the study of intersectionality is incredibly important, I think, to work, or incredibly important for those of us working on issues relating to the criminal legal system, poverty, education, voting rights access, because people are intersectional. People have intersectional identities, and they're experiencing interlocking, overlapping forms of oppression. So to have a clear analysis, we have to be able to identify the various ways that one's identity could expose them disproportionately to the harm, make them vulnerable to these particular harms. And so I want to use a very clear example, because if I'm suggesting, as Professor Crenshaw and others have, that intersectionality is a useful tool for surfacing forms of harm, for developing inclusive, robust remedies, then what we're trying to avoid are what we can think of as erasures, intersectional erasers. What happens when we fail to think intersectionally? Well, we have under-inclusive or ineffective remedies, and we're not going to be able to address the problem. So let's take the example of police violence. As I mentioned earlier, the incredible advocacy in that space has centered the problem of racism and racial bias within our systems of policing. Indeed, has identified the function of policing in many ways to discriminate and subordinate. And so when we think about the problem of police violence and its framing as a racial justice issue, I'm reminded of some of the advocacy by the Harriet Tubman Collective. Now, the Harriet Tubman Collective released a response, and this is in 2016, a response to the Vision for Black Lives. This was a policy platform. Their statement was called Disability Solidarity, Completing the Vision for Black Lives. Within the vision, we saw obviously a centering of police violence and the problem of police violence as a key issue impacting the lives of Black Americans, Black people here in the United States. But one of the things that was interesting was that there was no discussion of disability, or a very limited set of references to disability in the policy statement. So the Harriet Tubman Collective, which includes a group of incredible disability justice advocates, I encourage you all to look at their statement, it's still online. They released a statement where they invited the organizers and the developers of the Vision for Black Lives to include disability in their discussion of the problem of police violence, among other areas. I want to quote from their statement: that a movement whose primary focus is ending police brutality ignored the violence experienced by Black, disabled, and deaf people is problematic, considering that half of those killed by police have disabilities. So I think they capture it succinctly, that there are forms of violence experienced by Black people with disabilities in particular, that the failure to consider those experiences, given those harms, is a huge disservice and limits the ability of any vision or platform to respond effectively to the problem of police violence. Now, it's important to note that, after the public statement, the vision for Black Lives was revised to include disability. Now they're doing incredible work along the lines of disability justice. But I think that in many ways, this statement shows us that social movements, particularly those steeped in disability justice, have for a long time been surfacing disability in these existing movements for social change. I think I would also acknowledge that law professors, from our vantage point, those of us writing within criminal law, and in particular writing about the criminal legal system, we're well aware now about the racialized pathways into police violence. So racial profiling, the war on drugs, broken windows policing, hyper-policing in low-income communities. But an intersectional lens, and much of my research and the research of others that are looking at this sort of policing and criminal legal system issue, we're identifying other pathways into police violence that should also be discussed if we're, again, looking to end the problem. So we're talking not just about racial profiling and the war on drugs, although that's going to impact people of color who have disabilities. We're talking about wellness checks. We're talking about the implementation of involuntary commitment orders or quality of life policing that targets unsheltered communities, many of whom have disabilities, police involvement in crisis response. So again, expanding our scope and the way that we think about these problems allows us for more inclusive, effective remedies. And I think that's an important part of thinking not only about the law's role in social change, but more specifically, how the center will approach the work that we do.
So I want to delve a little bit more. You've obviously just talked extensively about the issues of the criminal legal system and how race and disability intersect with it. But I want to just give you an opportunity to expand on that a little bit more. We've been having a national conversation about problems of injustice in the context of race in the criminal legal system. How do issues relating to race and disability manifest in the criminal legal system? And how can we incorporate an understanding of disability and disability discrimination in these ongoing conversations about criminal justice reform?
Absolutely. I think that much of my work has been attempting to surface these intersections, to identify forms of sort of legal protection and redress that can respond to them. Let me talk about a few. So I referenced earlier the extensive literature discussing racial bias in our criminal legal system, from policing practices to charging, to plea bargaining, to sentencing decisions. We have empirical literature to support the racial disparity arguments and claims. Disability biases and discrimination, forms of discrimination, are also prevalent. I think the problem here is the limited data to substantiate, but we have experiences that have been shared by people with disabilities, the experiences of advocates that have identified some of these problems. And so if we know that we have a problem of racialized mass incarceration, racialized policing that's producing disproportionate harms for people of color, we can also think about the ways that the disproportionate harms are impacting people with disabilities, many of whom are people of color. So let's think about a few. So the criminalization of disability. So disability-related conduct becomes a basis. When I say the criminalization of disability, I mean disability-related conduct becomes a basis for police stops, probable cause for arrest, and even charging. We also know that we have a society that has, for decades, failed to invest in robust chronic care and crisis care mental health systems. That failure to invest has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. In low-income communities of color, we see difficulties accessing quality health care, difficulties accessing even disability diagnoses, misdiagnoses, in particular the failure to identify appropriate documentation, to Professor Catherine McFarland's work. These issues in particular must be thought alongside or viewed alongside the issues of policing. So communities where there are difficulties accessing quality health care are also communities that are over-policed. So a person in mental health crisis in one of those communities now faces an increased risk of being in crisis, perhaps, and then encountering law enforcement in that crisis, given these systemic divestments, given the failure, again, these are political economy issues, but they have a racialized character to them. And so the criminalization of disability, I argue, will impact people of color, and indeed, I suspect, impact them disproportionately. We know that there's bias and ableism in client representation in court proceedings. Our criminal courts are historically and today inaccessible to people with disabilities, individuals with physical disabilities, individuals that might have intellectual and developmental disabilities. There's incredible work by the ARC, the National ARC, and people like Leanne Davis and Shira Wachschlag who are doing incredible work to identify how people with IDD are impacted disproportionately by the lack of access in the criminal legal system. And again, we know that the character of our criminal legal system is disproportionately people of color. So again, these intersections are surfacing. Now, if we look at prisons and jails, the failure to provide accommodations to people in prisons and jails, reasonable accommodations, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, people, qualified individuals with disabilities, are entitled to receive reasonable accommodations. A failure to accommodate, to change a program policy or procedure to accommodate the needs of a qualified individual with a disability is discrimination. Under our iconic and watershed Olmstead decision, the failure to integrate people with disabilities into the most integrated setting, even within a prison, is a form of discrimination. Now, if we think about the failure to accommodate in prison, what does this mean? It's a failure to access educational programs, mental health treatment, rehabilitative programs. This might implicate whether a person can exit the facility, can leave prison earlier if they demonstrate rehabilitation by participation. So the failure to accommodate could mean people stay in prison longer because they couldn't access the perhaps anger management program, drug treatment program, et cetera. This is having huge implications for people with disabilities, people of color, and people of color with disabilities. Then we know violence and abuse in prisons and jails, the vulnerabilities that accrue when a person with disability is not given access to accommodations so that they can protect themselves in prison. There's the overuse of solitary confinement as a form of protection for people with disabilities. And so I think in many ways, some of the key problems that we're seeing, the response to mental health crisis in prison with OC spray, seclusion, solitary confinement, restraint. These practices, these torturous conditions, as the UN has identified, have race and disability dimensions. The Lyman Center at Yale Law School identified that there are disparities that we can see through the data. People with disabilities are disproportionately placed in solitary confinement. People of color also, along some dimensions, have heightened risk of exposure to solitary confinement. So I think the goal here is to, one, surface the disability dimensions in our work. That is the center's focus, to center the people who have that lived experience in our advocacy. And then I think in many ways to think about how the existing legal tools and forms of legal redress can respond and develop a set of inclusive remedies that address these problems.
So you've described now, I mean, in important ways, in some ways, the need for this center, but I'd like to talk about what the center is going to do a little bit. Can you share with us the mission of the Center for Racial and Disability Justice, and also why we need this center?
Absolutely. So I think our mission is relatively simple. We're here to promote justice for people with disabilities, people of color, and people at the intersection. It's intentionally broad. I think that the center will be as successful as the communities, organizations that we connect with. And I think that in many ways, although I've started with some of the key social problems that we can see involving sort of racial discrimination, disability discrimination, there are such possibilities for change. There's incredible organizing happening here in the city of Chicago and beyond. I'm thinking of Access Living, I'm thinking of the ARC, Equip for Equality, the incredible work of people that are thinking intersectionally, centering race and disability in their advocacy to address issues of access to the ballot box, of educational equity, of course, criminal legal system reform and transformative change. And so I think our mission is simple. Our focus is intentionally broad, although in our first year we will focus primarily on the criminal legal system set of issues that I've identified and surfaced in our discussion, healthcare discrimination, and access to the courts. We see ourselves as really, or envision ourselves as providing a hub of research, data, and support for the existing organizers and advocates that are thinking about these issues already. So we want to provide technical assistance and support, cutting edge research. One of the key issues, and Dr. Nicholas Lawson talks a lot about this, so I want to amplify his efforts. We need to document and identify opportunities to collect data on some of these problems, because I think the failure to collect data in many ways is limiting our ability to respond and remedy these social problems. So we want to be a part of that effort. We also want to support practitioners, law students, policymakers, researchers that want to think through these issues through funding and support, to have people that come to the center that study these issues intersectionally. We can also amplify and produce, I think, research that, again, will further the center's mission. And I think lastly, we want to be a hub of sort of public engagement and education here at the law school, here in the great city of Chicago. There's so many opportunities to connect up, again, with the incredible organizing that's happening. In particular, many of you might know of our terrific clinics here at the law school. They're doing incredible work, and one of the goals of the center is to connect and partner with some of the advocacy, the policy advocacy that they're doing, the research, and then the public education opportunities. That's our goal, at least in our first year.
Wow, and as you can see, I mean, this is incredible, the work that Professor Morgan's doing. I'm just double checking. It looks like we have some technical difficulties with the Q&A when we're about to move into it after the next question. So I'm going to just take care of that. And I want to just build on this. So, you've just described an incredibly ambitious first year for the center. How can members of our community connect with the work of the center?
Absolutely. So I should say that we wouldn't have a center without our incredibly engaged community, our alumni, our donors, our incredible staff, my colleagues here on the faculty, and our students. And so it's going to be vitally important for us to connect with those of you that are already doing this work. So one thing that I think is important to state is that, the center, I think of as kind of a convener of organizers, activists, scholars, practitioners that are doing this work. So we're going to rely on you to come to us, to bring us ideas so that we can help you do your work. I referenced earlier the need for data. We're bringing a team of researchers on board. We want to develop a set of research programs that will help us identify, again, some of the forms of racial and disability discrimination that we're seeing, let's say, in our courts. We're going to need partners for that. For public officials, in particular, if you're interested in tackling questions of ableism within your organizations, we can be effective partners for that. I think that in particular for our students, we welcome student support in the form of research, support of our programs, that's already happening, volunteers that want to be a part of, again, effectuating the center's mission in particular. And then lastly, we've been sustained by the incredible support of our donors. I think that the work here and the support that your financial contributions can provide will reap benefits for our greater community. That's the goal. And again, we're really grateful for the existing support and just hope that we can find new ways of partnering with our alumni, with the broader community, practitioners and students that are interested in our mission.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, it's been wonderful to watch actually the incredibly collaborative leadership approach that you have to this center, and the partnerships that you've built just in a few months at Northwestern, across Chicago, with national organizations. It's really terrific. So now I'm going to turn to our Q&A, where we already have some questions, and I encourage more people to add in questions as they have them. So I have a question about women and disabilities in particular. And so I wondered if you might speak to this question of how gender intersects with the set of issues you've been discussing.
Absolutely. And I think that in many ways, when I note that we're going to have an intersectional approach, I don't want to suggest that we'll only be focusing on race and disability. I think that it's important to center those two identities, to establish the connection at a law school in particular, because I think there needs to be adequate surfacing of the forms of racial and disability discrimination in particular. But when we think about gender, I think it has to be acknowledged that in particular women and trans women in particular are also vulnerable to these interlocking and overlapping forms of oppression. When I think about the prison setting, and the jail setting in particular. And I will note, I'm going to talk about some difficult content, so content warning. But there was some data that came out of the state of California that suggested that incarcerated women had a diagnosed disability at a rate of about 85 to 95%. Those particular disabilities were psychiatric disabilities. Sometimes you might hear the term mental illness as a part of a movement for disability rights and justice. I use the destigmatizing term psychiatric disability. Many of the women that reported having psychiatric disabilities were survivors of sexual violence, and they're incarcerated in our prisons in California. I think that it's important to surface how the pathways into prisons can also criminalize on the basis of disability. There's incredible work by organizers at Survived and Punished that identify that forms of resistance to forms of gender-based violence can be a basis for criminalization and can also impact women that have psychiatric disabilities, PTSD, and other conditions that accrue from histories of abuse. I think that needs to be surfaced, and indeed it already is. I've identified some organizations that are doing that work. In our own work, we're going to be looking at those issues as well. I also, want to think about when we identify disabilities, particularly within what we call criminalized groups, people who are incarcerated, it's not to stigmatize or denigrate disability. We want to be mindful, and this is kind of an important topic within disability rights and justice movements and literature today. We want to be mindful of how we talk about disability and we frame disability. In particular, our discussions of disability and how it can be produced by forms of gender violence. And so I'm thinking about the work of Professors Karen Tanney and Jasmine Harris and their work to kind of identify the disability frame in particular. We want to be mindful that we don't want to stigmatize, but we want to identify that there's a relationship between systemic forms of violence, the prevalence of gender-based violence in society, and then the production, if you will, of disabilities, and how to then support, and then how to then talk about that problem. Again, the pathways into prison, support for our incarcerated women with disabilities, and then importantly, the pathways out. And a centering of the function of, in many cases, our criminal legal system as a response to people that don't have access because our systems, our society has not put in the resources to support mental health and thriving, for instance. So, so much more that I could say, but I do appreciate the question.
And one of the follow-up questions, in some ways, that flows from what you just said, is a follow-up question around mental health. So, the question is: you mentioned under and misdiagnosis, and the person would like to know: is there current research about the extent of under misdiagnosis in carceral settings, and how do you think that information would be best gathered? And is that something the center plans to explore?
Well, that's an incredible project for us. I will say that there are researchers that are looking at disability in prisons, and in particular this issue of diagnosis, largely dealing with physical disabilities. So one thing of thinking about, one way of thinking about disability in prison is that we have incarcerated people that are serving very lengthy sentences. They're aging in prison, and one of the impacts of aging is the development of disabilities. And so researchers like Dr. Bree Williams have been looking at some of these issues of disability among our aging prisoner populations and identified largely how there are issues getting access to rehabilitative care and treatment and support within the carceral setting. Okay, the issue of diagnosis specifically is a tricky one. So when you think about the prison context, one of the things you want to keep in mind is that the safety and security interest will be the utmost sort of focus for a prison facility. And that in many cases can conflict with the need for care and the need for treatment. Indeed, the wishes, let's say, of correctional doctors that are in those facilities. So when you're in prison, getting access to care is difficult. You might not be believed. Your particular mental health, medical, rehabilitative needs might conflict with, again, the security goals of the facility, many of which I dispute as a former prisoner rights litigator. I think it's important to think about how that security, health, conflict, and tension actually harms people that are attempting to access care. But oftentimes, prisons are understaffed and under-resourced, and the quality of the diagnosis, the availability of records within the facility will implicate how one is able to advocate for themselves for medical and mental health treatment, which is to say you can have an inaccurate diagnosis because the paperwork has been misplaced. You can have an inaccurate diagnosis because the doctor didn't spend enough time with you, or you were screened by somebody that didn't have the appropriate credentials. And so the problem of diagnosis and the misdiagnosis in particular, I think needs to be studied more in the prison context. We see litigators across the country that are bringing these cases, class action cases, to get constitutional treatment for incarcerated people, access to medical and mental health care. And many of the issues that they're identifying in their complaints and in their briefings suggest that we have issues of misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis, missing a cancer diagnosis, treating it as something else, can obviously have deadly consequences. So there needs to be more research. But I will point to, again, the extant literature within the school space. That's where you see, again, scholars like Subhani Anima and Beth Ferry and David Connor have identified the ways in which students of color in particular, Black students and Latinx students, are characterized as having behavioral problems as opposed to diagnoses that might lead to better accommodations, inclusive classroom practices, and of course support so that they can remain in the classroom. And so in many ways, that's why I'm informed by the School of Education literature and those that are talking about youth in schools and the pathways that those youth experience into the criminal legal system, because we see some of the literature about the misdiagnoses and about the failures to diagnose most in that space. And I think there are some insights that we can draw in the prison space, but we need to have more research that is directed at people with disabilities who are in prison.
Another question focuses on following up on some of what you were saying about the criminal legal system. The question is, Professor Morgan, can you discuss existing or new avenues for law enforcement and criminal courts to tackle issues in police surveillance, searches, and suspicion of those with physical and psychological conditions, abilities, appearances, and behaviors that do not conform to the dominant form. What tools can be used and implemented to address racial and disability bias?
Wow, that's a really profound question. Okay, so one thing to think about is, in my research, I've talked about the ways that disability-related behaviors can form the basis for reasonable suspicion, which is under the Terry versus Ohio case and our Fourth Amendment case law, a lawful basis for a police stop. So I think about Elijah McClain, who was a Black kid with a disability, autism, and he was stopped by Aurora police. He was called in by a quote-unquote concerned neighbor, and he was in the middle of summer wearing a ski mask to accommodate his anemia. And when he's stopped by police, the basis is him acting strangely, weirdly. That stop very tragically results in Elijah McClain losing his life, being killed by police because they administer an excessively high dose of ketamine. So I use that example just to demonstrate there's a stark, very serious problem here. If disability-related behaviors, which can be characterized as weird or strange, not bases that at all indicate any indication of criminal suspicion. When that conflation happens, it's very dangerous. You also hear cases of people, maybe stroke survivors, people with speech disabilities being labeled as drunk in public. And so these are very real cases. So it's important, I think, to the question to think about closing off doctrinal pathways to using disability-related behaviors as a basis for reasonable suspicion. I talk about some of the ways to do that in a paper called Disabilities, Fourth Amendment. To the technology point, I'm a critic, and so I'm skeptical of technology being a solution to all manner of problems. Without a critical analysis, it's difficult to see technology in that way. And of course, I'm informed by scholars like Bennett Capers and Ngozi Ikediba, people that have been thinking, Jessica Egeland, that have been thinking about some of these possibilities, but also pitfalls of technology. And so one thing that you can think about is, okay, are there forms of technology that can be deployed to protect, not to surveil, right? Because we don't want to create a situation where there are databases of the people with disabilities in communities. We have to be very mindful of the harm and the privacy intrusion that could result. But are there forms of technology that can assist police? I know there's been some thinking about that, the use of police body cameras to observe disability-related behaviors, and then that information would be transmitted back to the particular officer so they'd know it's a disability-based behavior, not a criminal behavior. I think that we have to look at these approaches, possibilities, with a healthy dose of skepticism. People with disabilities have a history of state surveillance, surveilling them in the community. Susan Schweck's work on the ugly laws show how simply appearing in public with a disability and seeking financial support, quote unquote begging, right, could render someone liable to criminal sanction and arrest, removal from the street. Our long history, the long history of institutionalization of people with disabilities to survey and surveil, rather, their reproductive capacities, to forcibly sterilize them. These all come from surveillance, right? They might not look like, again, the technological surveillance of today, but, as Ruha Benjamin and others have said, I think we have to recognize that not all technology is quote unquote new, that there could be new ways of instantiating old forms of bias. And I'm skeptical, but I think that there are discussions. Data and Society has released ways of thinking about people with disabilities and our algorithmic decision making, for instance. I'm more optimistic about how we can consider disability-based bias, design algorithms that would assess whether someone is eligible for, let's say, welfare assistance, and do so in ways that are more protective of rights than hoping that technology can change the fundamental way that people with disabilities are policed in society. So that's sort of my initial reactions, and as I said, healthy dose of skepticism to the very important question.
So one of our audience members is joining us from Spain, where it's currently
Wow.
the evening,
Good to have them.
and the question. This person says, congratulations for the ambitious mission of the center. I would like to ask you, please, some details about international cooperation projects with overseas institutions, considering that all of these themes are also global challenges. And so I thought I'd, it sounds like you have somebody who already wants to partner internationally.
And I welcome that, and I think it's so important, and I'm glad for the question. It's so important to name that these are global struggles. We have a Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that the United States has not signed, our international human rights framework for thinking about the rights of people with disabilities. And so I welcome collaborations to think globally, to think about, in particular, how there are connections between the ways that people with disabilities are policed, the limited access that they might have to forms of human thriving, whether it's the ability to, earn a living wage, to access housing. There are templates, models, if you will, for ways of thinking about how to respond to these social problems that we can draw from abroad, from again, the struggles from abroad. But there's also ways, I think, of casting the problems informed by decolonial struggles, informed by struggles against imperialism. Jamelia Aravelis' work comes to mind in that register. So I welcome those collaborations and encourage everyone to think globally about some of the sort of social, racial, and disability problems that we're identifying and potential solutions. But yes, candidly, I'm informed by the work and would love to partner with anybody that is interested and not here, obviously, in the States.
So we've had a couple of different questions come in about issues of homelessness and disability. One that focuses on its intersection also with domestic violence and lack of access to civil courts due to accommodations denial, but also just more broadly. And so I thought I'd bring those two questions together and ask for your perspective on how you see homelessness as fitting into the center's work.
It's important to frame the issue of affordable housing, right, as a failure to invest in not only affordable housing, and I'll name it specifically. We need to build more housing in a number of American cities, just quite frankly. But we also need to build accessible housing. And I think that that's often left out of our discussions of affordable housing. When I talked about poverty earlier, I think we have to think about how having a disability in a society that's not, that's one where ableism is pervasive, where we're not accommodating disabilities and providing people the support they need to live independently in their homes, that creates conditions where people are vulnerable to homelessness. We have unsheltered communities that are existing, attempting to survive in American cities. Many of them are people with disabilities. Specifically, I'll name veterans. I'll name the work of Sunita Patel and others at the Veterans Clinic at UCLA Law School to talk about and center disability in the ways that having a disability renders one vulnerable to poverty, renders one vulnerable to losing home. I mean, medical debt we know is a leading cause of losing one's livelihood, of bankruptcy in particular. And so from the policing standpoint, I'm particularly concerned the sweeps, the use of order maintenance style policing efforts to target unsheltered communities has huge disability rights implications. And I think that in particular, a sweep that will completely separate, a person from, difficult to obtain prescription drugs, that has huge impacts on their healthcare outcomes. And so the question of shelters. Our shelters, largely, we have issues of accessibility in terms of our shelters. They're dangerous places in some cases. They physically can't be accessed. There's not the support and treatment and recognition that unsheltered community members have a number of disabilities that can be accommodated. I think it's important to kind of include, again, access and questions of disability discrimination and how we think about the problem of homelessness, as it's been called, without sidelining, again, the political economy questions. If we invested in a robust healthcare system, social safety net, we can imagine some of these issues that show up in the form of people in public space in need of permanent housing. We can make that connection, again, I think better solve that problem. And so I welcome, again, any efforts to partner. Want to acknowledge the work of the Homelessness Union in the Western states that have been doing work and talking about disability in particular. So again, this is something that I think we should also be thinking about in our policing and affordable housing conversations as well.
There also is a question about how dependent Illinois is on nursing homes, and a question about how we can achieve more community living given issues of shortages of home care workers, affordable housing, and so so I'm curious kind of how you see the center's work as potentially interacting with these questions of kind of home-based care and affordable housing.
Absolutely. So I want to plug the work of Access Living, and they've been thinking a lot about, obviously as the City of Chicago's Center for Independent Living, they've been doing this work for decades to kind of think through how policy can better support some of the issues that the questioner has identified. So one, the goal of disability rights is the right to, of many of the goals, I should say, one of many, an important one is this independent living, right? How can we keep people in their homes and out of institutions? I'm within a school of thought and movement that thinks of a nursing home as a type of institution, an institution that's smaller, not the large congregate institutions that we could see characterizing, let's say, the mid-20th century up through from the early 20th to the mid-20th, at least in the heyday, but definitely not consistent with, I think, the values of independent living. We need to support our in-home health workers, right? So traditionally, historically, this has been a group of people that are underpaid, understaffed, overworked. Also in a number of jurisdictions, predominantly people of color, women of color in particular. So what does it look like to develop pathways, right, to job training programs, to increase the wages, to develop a set of social responses that would support this workforce, but also to recognize that much of the care work that's provided by people with disabilities, provided for and alongside people with disabilities, I should say, are provided by relatives, and they're uncompensated. And so I think, again, Professor Laura Maudlin talks about this as well, but we have to center care work in disability rights in our discussions. The over-reliance on nursing homes, thinking about, again, much of the advocacy around home and community-based waivers. We have a system that does bias towards institutionalization as opposed to providing in-home care. These are long-standing issues within disability rights, and I think the advocacy and framing of groups like the Centers for Independent Living across the country, but again, Access Living, to bring these issues to the forefront of media attention, political sort of organizing and will is very important, because we're not going to have independent living unless we support our care workers, unless we support the workers that are in the home, recognizing all the dynamics that are creating conditions where people might end up in institutions. And then again, a last shout out to the Olmstead litigation, right, to keep people out of institutions and to advocate for people that are at risk of institutionalization. Some of these cases are brought by our Department of Justice. Some of these cases and the identification of these issues come from our protection and advocacy organizations, disability rights advocate organizations like Equip for Equality here in Illinois. This is important work. This has to be supported and I think has to be a part of our conversation. I would love to be a part of this advocacy, and I think hope that the center can make research, policy, headway in making this issue a forefront of what we talk about in both politics and scholarly spaces, we'll say.
So elections are on people's minds right now. Yes. And so I also got a question about accessibility in voting and kind of how these issues you're talking about interact with our voting and electoral system.
Absolutely. So, you know, one thing to, again, there's incredible advocates out here. I will shout out the ARC again, the disability community and protection advocacy organizations that have brought these cases. So we have to think about the fundamental right to vote as a key disability rights issue. So scholars like Rabia Belt have centered this in their own work. There's a history of excluding, deeming incompetent people with disabilities because they have disabilities. And that's wrong. That's a kind of a feature of ableism, this connection between having a disability and incapacity and inability to do one's job. I will point to the Pennsylvania Senate race as an example of that. You know, Fetterman's disability centering in discussions of his disability after a stroke, his inability to get the job done. Some of that was surfaced in the narrative. But so again, if we talk about voting, I want to talk about obviously the access to the ballot. So thinking about the role of state legislators and the efforts across the country during a pandemic to not allow people with disabilities to vote absentee, to change the hours, to make it difficult to access. These are important disability rights issues as much as they are, it has to be said, important racial justice issues. And so I think that for those of us that are interested in these issues, again, the incredible litigation advocacy that's happening on the ground has to be named. But we have to support these efforts. I know here at the law school, there were a number of opportunities, one to partner with Equip for Equality to help people access the voting booth. I think we have to think about, again, these longstanding state laws that have developed a set of exclusions on the basis of disability, developing legal strategies, advocacy strategies to overturn them. It's a pressing issue. I think that this is a powerful constituent group that has too long been denied the rights that so many might take for granted, but are indeed under assault in this very moment. And so voting and access to the ballot is another issue that I think we have to kind of think about. And again, that race disability angle, I think, is going to help us sort of surface some of the barriers in helpful and inclusive ways.
So a final set of questions. Focus on, we got asked how Northwestern decided to invest in and focus on these critical issues, and of course that relates to your having this incredible vision for this center. But also people want to know how they can get involved, and I'm seeing this from people who are local, but also I had someone ask from New York, we've obviously had someone ask from Spain, wow. And so I just wanted to give you a moment to talk about how people who would like to engage with you and the center can do so.
Wow, it's really humbling to see that there's such interest and, again, support, and I'm here because of community and the people that have influenced me, the incredible disability justice community members that have supported me and helped me think through these issues and do this work. So to get involved, so we have a wonderful team here at Northwestern that set up a website for us, or a web page. So if you look on the Northwestern Law School website and you just include in our search box Center for Racial and Disability Justice, you can access our webpage. On the webpage, you'll see my contact information. I welcome emails, so get in touch with me. I want to hear what your ideas are. We're in the growth phase. This is a really likely possibility. You also can see a link to donate if that's how you'd like to participate. But really, we're looking for people with ideas, volunteers, connections to develop and build out the center's work. And I guess the best way I would say at this present moment is to check us out online, to email me. I'm happy to engage across any set of issues. I guess I'll also say for students that are interested in this work, pre-law students, happy to talk. Again, that's a key part of our work too, supporting the next generation of law students and lawyers and advocates that want to think about these issues. So check us out online, send me a note, it'd be great to hear from you.
Well, I want to conclude by just thanking Professor Morgan and all of you who joined us today. your vision, your impactful leadership. We're just so lucky to have here at Northwestern, but also I'm just so excited for the impact that this center is going to make on society. I know that Professor Morgan's just given you some ideas on how to connect with the center. I'd like to add that if this work resonates with you, please do consider making a gift to the center, which you can do through the Innovating for Impact Fund and indicating that your gift is for the Center for Racial and Disability Justice. And I believe that the URL has just been put in the chat. Is that correct? Okay, good. I'm getting thumbs up. But for anyone who needs it, it's https giving.northwestern.edu /innovating for impact. So with that, I just want, and I just want to make clear, gifts of any size are really welcomed to support the important work of this center. And with that, I just want to thank you again for your important work, Professor Morgan, and to all of you for joining us for today's launch event for the center.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Professor Osofsky.